Okay, thanks very much. Oh yes.
Well, they do that as an announcement. We have these last sessions that will end up, if we are around 6:30. Yeah. The idea is that today dinner is free. You are free to have dinner wherever you want. It's not included in the budget, so you can have dinner here. There are several restaurants. Jan is going to give us an indication because there are also walking distance restaurants in the town. So we are all free to do whatever we want. Joe and Chris are organizing a little musical gathering here in this room after dinner. Whoever wants to come and join and do some drumming with Joe.
What time?
What time, Joe?
I don't know. What time is dinner?
I think we're finishing at 7.
Well, we're finishing at 7. So let's say from 7 to 8:30 dinner. 8:30 to 9? 9.
Make it 9 so people can kind of...
9, okay?
Yeah.
So you are free to move in and out whenever you want, okay?
Okay, thanks everyone. Okay, so my name is Tom Swan. I'm currently a lead career fellow at Loughborough University, working in political theory and particularly anarchist political theory. I'm going to talk a little bit today about some of the work we've been doing over the last few years on anarchist cybernetics. Yeah, so I'm just going to give a very brief kind of overview to start with about work that I conducted during my PhD at the School of Management at the University of Leicester. And that's stuff that's been published in this article in Journal Ephemeron, Anarchist Cybernetics, and I've also got a book coming out hopefully towards the end of next year on the same topic, but a kind of expanded view of that. So I'm going to kind of today talk a little bit about what anarchist cybernetics is, or where the connection between anarchism and cybernetics is, and also a little bit kind of picking up on this, because this research was started almost a decade ago, around about the time of the Occupy movement and the Arab Spring, and I'm going to try and pick up on that a little bit on how sort of radical politics has developed since then, and how cybernetics and anarchist connection with cybernetics might still be relevant, even though politics have moved on a little bit. So to start with, this is a very kind of simplified version of the VSM. Quite thankful, it's the first time I've ever actually presented in front of people who know what cybernetics is, so I'm very thankful I don't have to explain this in any detail. Hopefully as I go through it will be clear what exactly I mean by anarchism and how that's relevant. This is based on the Occupy movement, the kind of model of organisation of participatory democracy that was common to Occupy, particularly Occupy Wall Street. So we know the VSM, but how does this relate to anarchism and anarchist organisation? Well, in Occupy, what we saw was two or three levels of activity or decision making that I think map on quite well to the VSM. So on the one hand, we have System 1 units that we know. In Occupy, these were made up by working groups and caucuses. So the working groups were basically individual units of any Occupy camp that were dealing with specific tasks. So there'd be working groups covering sanitation in the camps, working groups dealing with the kitchen, working groups dealing with media, planning protests, basically any kind of activities that went on within the Occupy camp. That was the remit of a specific working group. So that was the kind of day-to-day activities of these camps. And they obviously coordinated, so if we think about the kind of System 2 functions of coordination between them, they would have meetings together, they would be discussing things day to day during the camp, and they managed to coordinate quite effectively to run these camps as kind of mini communities over a period of weeks and months in some cases. If we move up the model, with the sort of higher level functions, these were primarily housed in the general assemblies of the occupied camps. So these were massive assemblies, at the most in Occupy Wall Street, over 1,000 people involved in these. and these were participatory decision-making structures. And these were what governed the activities of the working groups. So we can see the higher level function that determines how the working groups operate. The important thing, and this is what's important for the kind of anarchist development of cybernetics, or how cybernetics can be relevant to anarchism, is there's exactly the same people involved at these two levels. Okay, so there was no, at the start at least, there wasn't even a kind of delegate structure of saying, well, some people from the bottom are going to go to the top to make decisions that then influence the bottom. Everyone was involved in that. Now that structure kind of broke down a little bit at a certain point in the camps, because these camps were incredibly transient in terms of who was taking part at any given moment. Particularly somewhere like New York, there was a lot of tourists turning up to the camps and taking part in general assemblies. So at some point they decided, well, that's not the most effective way to actually carry out that kind of function. So they introduced spokes councils, and that was basically a delegate council. So different working groups and caucuses would send delegates who were mandated to make decisions at these spokes councils. But again, there's a kind of direct and participatory democratic structure in place here. So this is one of the important things when we talk about how we can understand anarchist organisation through cybernetics, is even though we have these different levels of decision making, different levels of activity, it's to one degree or another the same people involved at both levels. There's no kind of executive functions that are hijacked.
Quick question about the word anarchist. Can you say a little bit about what anarchism is to you? So just because I'm relating it to order, but now I see the structured model and I'm lost.
Yeah. So principally what I mean by anarchism is a political movement built around self-organisation and self-governance. So how do communities govern themselves without the state? How do they arrange their economic affairs in non-capitalist ways? This is the kind of primary definition of anarchism I'm working with.
Thank you.
But I'll talk a little bit more about that as I can. So the relationship between anarchism and cybernetics is not just something that I've kind of developed myself on the back of looking at Occupy movement. This is actually, there's some historical precedent here. So we go back to the 1960s, 1963 in particular. There's this journal, Anarchy, which was published in the UK, edited by Colin Ward, who was one of the leading figures of anarchism in the UK post-war. And there was two articles published in this in 1963, one by William Gray Walter, who I'm sure everyone's familiar with, and then a follow-up article by John McEwen. And the second article in particular by John D. McEwen goes into some detail about how cybernetics and science of self-organisation can be relevant for anarchism. And one of the key concepts that he picks up on here, which is really, really important, I think, is the distinction between structural hierarchy and functional hierarchy. So I think when Wolfgang was talking this morning about the distinction Beer makes, or the idea of the kind of logic of hierarchy, this is what McEwen talks about. He takes this from Gordon Pask's work, so he draws this directly from Pask. The idea of functional hierarchy is where, within the VSM, we can see these different functions that are nested hierarchically, where the remit of one function is determined by the function above it. The important distinction between structural and functional hierarchy here is that these different functions don't need to be replicated in a hierarchical organizational structure. So when Pask talks about this, he talks about the executive or executive functions in a company, secretarial functions, office boy functions, and he says that actually whoever's in the office boy position can take executive functions. Okay, so there's no necessary correlation between this hierarchical structure in the organisation and this functional hierarchy that specifies different functions. So basically it's another way of trying to articulate the VSM in a non-hierarchical way. Just on some of the kind of historical connections, so I'm not a historian, but there are very interesting historical connections between anarchism and cybernetics. So this issue of Anarchy Journal here, this isn't the issue from 1963, this is the first issue of it. But you might not be able to read it clearly, but here one of the contributors is Nicholas Walter. So he was William Grey Walter's son. He was one of the key figures in British anarchism post-war. Even going back further, which is a kind of interesting connection, William Grey Walter's father, Karl Walter, was involved in anarchism and was at the International Anarchist Congress, I believe in 1897. And there's some suggestion that he turned to fascism after that. I don't really know much about him as a person, but there seems to be some kind of family connection, which I think is probably why William Grey Walter was writing in Anarchy, why he was asked to do that. Some other authors have developed some of these connections. Colin Ward, as I mentioned already, in a book, in an article called Anarchism as a Theory of Organisation. He mentioned cybernetics, I think picking it up from what John McEwen wrote in Anarchy. In the Netherlands, Roel van Dam, some of you might know, member of the Provo movement in the early 1960s in the Netherlands. Later influenced by cybernetics and thinking about the role of sort of radicals in society to steer society and how radicals play a role in kind of feedback loop within society. Marius de Kuijs, Dutch political philosopher, also in a book on political philosophy and organisation theory, draws on cybernetics and relates it to Peter Kropotkin, our kind of seminal figure in anarchism, relates to his work. Some of this kind of history is covered in an article in the journal Anarchist Studies by John Duda, published in 2013. So if anyone is interested in the history of these connections between anarchism and cybernetics, I'd recommend reading that. And also John's PhD thesis that was, I don't think it's managed to turn into a book yet, but it is available online. He goes into a lot of the science of self-organisation, how that relates to political ideas of self-organisation. The next one I want to show, this is a kind of new connection that's potentially emerged. Just everyone's sitting down, so this is quite stark in this one. So this is an image of anarchist organisation that was drawn in 1949 by an Italian anarchist, Ugo Fedeli. This was in his notes on the International Anarchist Congress in 1949 in Paris. This was just discovered this by accident, really, when an anarchist historian who's currently doing some work in the archives at the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam posted this on Twitter, and immediately I thought, okay, so this is interesting that in 1949 this guy, Ugo Fedeli, again, not much known about him, he was kind of active in Russia and France and Latin America. Don't know much about him really. He clearly saw something in this diagram that spoke to an anarchist theory of organisation. So there might be some connections there, but again, this is just literally in the last few weeks that this kind of emerged, so potentially something interesting there. So, part of the kind of narrative that I'm kind of drawing here is, if we think about radical politics, as I said, just start thinking about these ideas. In 2011, the Occupy movement, Arab Spring, it was these horizontalist, street movements of radical politics. That kind of assembly function was very common to them. This was seen as a new model of democracy. Obviously, that didn't really transpire, so these movements all died out in one way or another. What we saw is what's being referred to as the electoral turn in radical politics. Okay? So a lot of these movements, if you look at Greece and Spain, for example, you see new parties like Syriza and Podemos emerging that capture some of the energy of these movements, and in the case of Podemos particularly, some of the kind of participatory democratic ethos of them, and try and channel that energy into a different strategy. So rather than trying to organise autonomously and create this kind of peaceful revolution, you think, well, we have to work through the state and change it from the inside somehow. With varying kind of levels of success, particularly if you look at Syriza's fortunes in Greece. But we see similar kind of movements with the Scottish National Party after the independence referendum in 2014, which again tried to capture what was this vast, almost kind of horizontal movement, very much captured and channeled into a very centralised political party. But even now, if we look at Bernie Sanders' campaign in the US and the Labour Party currently under Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, again trying to take some of the participatory ethos of these 2011 movements and channel that into a more institutionalised politics. So that's kind of where I want to kind of take this discussion now. What I want to kind of argue is that this electoral term doesn't necessitate an abandonment of that participatory democratic politics. So, John MacDonald, the current Chancellor of the UK, potentially could be Chancellor in a couple of months, he's described his strategy to politics as working in and against the state. Okay, so I'm not suggesting he's an anarchist by any means, but there's an interesting characteristic to these parties of saying we're going to, these kind of institutions, political parties, the state that were characteristically antagonistic to more radical social movements are now seen as vehicles that can be perhaps reformed, perhaps revolutionised, to bring about some of the change that participatory movements have sought to see. And part of this is kind of responding to the anarchist critique of the state, and this is from an article from Francis Dupuy-Derry. He kind of characterises how anarchists view the state, and part of the anarchist critique of the state, as seeing states as systems of domination, constellation of institutions, and a mass of individual agents and social relationships, involving a non-egalitarian division of political work involving two classes, the governors and the governed. So this is the kind of view of the state that has characterised the anarchist critique. So the question is, a strategy that goes in and against the state, how does it actually operate? If it, on the one hand, tries to channel this participatory ethos, and on the other hand, be pretty intrusive critique. What I want to try and explore a little bit is how cybernetics might be useful in articulating that strategy. So thinking about institutions then, so Milburn and Russell in a recent article describe institutions as things that train us to adopt a particular subjectivity, a particular mode of thinking and acting. Through repetition, we internalise this institutional logic and come to anticipate it and act accordingly, until it eventually comes to structure the common sense view of human possibility. So the question then for this shift in radical politics in and against the state or in and against institutions is how to make institutions, how to make this institutional logic work in ways that engender participatory democracy. I'm going to skip this because it's not that important. So what Milburn and Russell argue is that new forms of institutions are needed that can provide each of us with the opportunity and perhaps obligation to learn what it actually means for us to take collective decisions over our common future. So again, this is about reshaping the institutions that social movements engage with and try and alter. There's two examples of this that I want to kind of discuss, and in a minute I'll kind of try and bring us back to kind of anarchist cybernetics or counter organisation. The two examples, which I think is, what people have talked about today in various presentations are other examples of this kind of this kind of politics, I think, particularly some of the commons governance stuff that was discussed this morning. But two examples that are quite interesting is the idea of public commons partnerships, and particularly the kind of partnership around energy provision in Wolfhagen, Germany, and Iceland's experience with participatory constitution. So in the case of the public commons partnership then, so this is a partnership between a cooperative set up to represent the citizens of the town, the public administration, local government, and the energy provider. So they set up this partnership, and the director of this partnership describes it as, it says, Through the cooperative participation, we want to make the citizens not only co-owners and co-earners, but through the form of a direct participation in the Staatswerke, also co-decision makers. For future projects, citizens and electricity customers will be at the table from the very beginning. And as Milburn and Russell put this, the distributed model of governance means that power, understood here as the capacity to shape the collective conditions under which we live our lives, is less concentrated in the state apparatus. Rather than a centralised and paternalistic state making decisions on behalf of consumers and the electorate, we instead see the possibility for distributed forms of governance that incubate and promote new forms of relationships between citizens. So this is kind of seeing how some of the functions that states have historically played might be realised in different ways, in ways that don't involve the state. In Iceland we see something similar. So after the financial crash in 2008, Iceland was particularly, for those who remember, Iceland was hit particularly hard by the financial crash due to the reliance on the finance industry in the country. They decided to try and write a new constitution for the country. And they tried to do that in a participatory way. So first they had a National Assembly, where 1,000 people selected at random decided the principles of their community. After that, they elected a constitutional council of 25 people to actually write the constitution. And importantly, that constitutional council had to be made up of people who weren't serving politicians and weren't involved in civil service in any way. So this was the idea of the citizens having control over this process. Once they'd written the constitution, which was done through consultation, through sharing drafts on Facebook, and having different channels where people could comment on it and be involved in the process, it was put to a referendum. I mean, it's not really part of the story here, but it ultimately failed, this constitution, because it passed the referendum, then the government changed, the centre-right government got back into power and just ditched the whole plan. So, kind of a sad end to that story, but perhaps another reason why we think of these things as needing to happen outside of the state, or at least in opposition to the state, perhaps. Hill and Landmore, political theorists, has described the Icelandic experiment as involving direct popular participation at various stages of the process, so through the National Assembly, for example, elements of descriptive representativeness where direct participation wasn't possible, so the 1,000 randomly selected people were constructed to represent the demographics of the population. Also, the Constitutional Council had to have a certain proportion of women in it. And also involved transparency, so a lot of what the Constitutional Council was doing to write the Constitution was transparent. So importantly, this is, I think, one of the ways that I'm characterising this in my work I've done with others is through the idea of constitutionalising. So this is how some of the functions of how communities can be constituted and made sustainable can be done without a centralised state being in control of that process. So constitutionalising involves determining the principles, the rules, the institutions, and decision-making practices of a community. I was going to show a short video about this, but I think we'll just skip past that. But ultimately it's about how a community defines itself, and how a community can define itself in a participatory way. Skip past that. So how does this map onto the VSM then? So I think what we see with the examples of Iceland and of the Public Commons Partnership is quite a good articulation of the System 3, 4, 5 functions. It's the sort of strategic or grand strategic functions of the VSM. So here we can see how structures that are participatory in one way or another, democratic to different degrees, can replicate some of the functions of that VSM identifies as being necessary for any viable organisation. So in Iceland, for example, particularly sort of System 5 functions of determining the identity of the organisation, in this case the community, its core principles under which it's going to operate, these are subject to some level of participation in democracy. With the public common partnership, it's particularly the more strategic functions, like how do we actually organise energy provision for a particular community, as the example from Germany shows. With Occupy, what we see is particularly effective is the System 1 and 2 functions. So how these working groups operated and how they coordinated was actually incredibly effective if you consider the minimal resources they had, the huge numbers of people who were coming through these camps, the complex situations they were in. They managed to achieve a huge amount and set up these sort of miniature communities that sustained themselves until they were evicted. So the question is how we bring this together, and this is what I think, as I said, various aspects of what people have discussed already today get us part of the way towards this. So it's thinking about how we bring these together to make the System 3, 4, 5 functions, the sort of more strategic functions, more participatory. Because there's limits. So in Iceland, the participation was facilitated in certain ways. So again, of a population of over 300,000, only 1,000 were actually involved in that discussion and deliberation. For the Public Commons Partnership, representatives of the citizens sit on the boards and make decisions that way. So there are limits to how participatory these are. We can maybe say they're democratic, but there's limits to how participatory they are. So what I want to kind of ask is that enough? If we want to take the kind of anarchist politics seriously and think seriously about participatory democracy, is it enough to have these limited forms of participation, or do we need to try and go further and find ways of opening up these more strategic and grand strategic functions to more direct participation? So the question I want to close with is, what structures can we create that enable this? And importantly, if we're anarchists, might not agree with that, but if you do, how do we fulfil these functions without reproducing or reinforcing the state? And I think that's important. I think that's going to come across in a few of the presentations today. And I like the comment earlier about we don't want an adaptive state, we want an adaptive government. Let's say we want adaptive governance without an actual something concrete like the state or the government, but some process of constitutionalising, some process of governance that's open to participation and democracy. We'll finish there. Thank you very much.
Questions? 1, 2, 3. Thomas?
Can I just inquire, in the Iceland instance,
Yeah.
Why was it that the referendum came before the parliament? Normally I thought they would have got 2/3 or whatever, and then went for the referendum. How come it went the other way?
So basically there's, it's a kind of complex story there, but essentially what happened was when the process was started, it was a sort of centre-left government for power for the first time in Iceland's history. They set the process in motion, said that different steps are going to happen. The idea was it would go to the referendum. If it was approved, Parliament would approve it. But basically after the referendum, there was a new election and the centre-right government got back into power and decided to block the process. And it's still at this stage, they're still saying, we're going to review it and maybe take in some aspects of what passed in the referendum. But essentially to do with that kind of shift in sort of establishment power in the country.
5 minutes.
Yes.
What was in the referendum that was kind of quashed? So what did the participatory process generate in terms of what the Icelandic people wanted?
So it was 70% the same constitution as the old one. So there wasn't much. I think that's the nature of sort of a national constitution for a country, because it has to meet certain standards in terms of international law and stuff. But there's a lot in there about regulation of media ownership, regulation of ownership of natural resources, and particularly categorising fisheries as natural resources and property of the nation. So a lot about how that would be regulated, about how finance would be regulated, also about how new legislation could be proposed through citizen petitions and referendums. So there was some kind of trying to push the participation a bit further as well.
Yeah, the Occupy and 15M movements. On one hand, if one reads David Draper's account of Occupy Wall Street, extremely exhilarating, and eventually the whole thing is knocked down. And to understand that interface between, this is all going very well, and then when you look at the 15M movement, all across Spain, all these groups working, and again, they run up and they get all sorts of quotes, concessions for being able to not pay taxes on this, that, and the next thing, and then they run up against this national regulatory framework. And at that point, they think, oh, we've got to join this so-called democratic game. And have you any thoughts about these issues of moving beyond these kind of things that can and do work?
I mean, that's what I'm trying to kind of get at now, is how you can bridge that gap between these sort of participatory movements and affecting some kind of actual political change. I mean, the reason it was possible to the extent it was in Iceland, I would argue, is because there's this kind of semi-collapse of the state after the financial crash, at least in terms of the state's moral authority in the country. That created an opening that allowed this constitutional process to begin, and then when the kind of establishment reformed itself and retook power, they quashed that process. With Occupy 15, there was never that collapse in terms of the power of the state. So, I mean, those movements they're running into problems, yes, but they were also effectively stopped by state repression. So, the Occupy camps across the US were all evicted on the same day in kind of coordinated police action. The same thing happened in Spain, where all the camps were evicted at the same time. So there is a story there about where these sort of, I mean, don't know if people are familiar with John Holloway's idea of cracks in capitalism. So he's saying that you find these alternative economic and governance practices in cracks in the capitalist system. It would suggest something similar. There must be these cracks in the state for these things to emerge. How you create those cracks, that's a different question.
1 minute.
I'm always very cautious about words, and careful about the words I use, because they would often have all sorts of baggage. I'm really nervous about using anarchy, because anarchy in popular use is a synonym for chaos, whereas people I'm interested in are the opposite of chaos. They're self-organizing, highly responsive, highly resilient. And anarchist organizations are characterized, and I don't know, I'll ask Beth the question to what extent this is true, far more concerned with tearing down any authority than with really thinking through what the self-organizing alternative is. And so really, I avoid that and just look at self-organizing alternatives. You said in particular. What's your experience with anarchist organization and thought? How much is it about tearing down? How much is it about actually thinking through and dealing with the alternatives?
So I think, so first to bracket off the kind of more public relations question of how useful the term is. I mean, that's a discussion that can be had, and there's other terms people use which are more effective perhaps. In terms of actual anarchist organisations, so Mikhail Bakunin, one of the early anarchists, called this the passion for destruction, but he said the passion for destruction is also a creative passion. So it's on one hand negating something that exists, and at the same time creating something in its place. And that's, I think, where the VSN is really useful, is like, how do we actually create sustainable alternatives of self-governance to replace the ones that are being destroyed. But that means that anarchist organisation or anarchist politics has always been committed to those two paths, trying to antagonise and destroy and create alternatives.
Right. Thank you. Yeah.